This podcast may contain disturbing content for some listeners. It's intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
So with Clay, I sort of put the cart before the horse with him, and I had you go back through, pulled the clues. And this is like the clues from the phone call that he's having with Howard Stern. And I wanted to go over those with you.
Right. And so I've listened to, that is this real episode that we put out. And so we've recorded a lot of stuff out of order. I have to keep it straight in my head. And that's why I go back and listen to the shows, and I like to know what made it in, perhaps what didn't make it in. But essentially, we were jumping around at that point, and that it came out, and we were able to listen to it. And it was my first exposure to it. So I literally listened to it, and then we talked about it immediately, right?
Right.
Well,
and
now
we went and did some work on it, but now we're coming back to it.
Right. I feel like my perspective has not necessarily changed, but I feel like I got it more under my belt at this point.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Because I listened to Is This Real, which, includes the 17 minutes of the call. Now, one of the things I wanted to ask you, I don't know if you've listened to the episode. I know you've listened to the part of it that is Clay calling in or whatever. Do you feel like that is clipped? Here's why I ask. They start talking about, he says, if I don't do this, I'm going to get backlash. People are going to be like, why didn't you catch him? And, what am I going to do? Crawl through the phone? And he's like, I can't even get a phone system that works on air.
When you say clipped, what do you mean clipped?
Was it not a live call?
So I pulled up this, and this comes up a couple of times. I pulled up a set of, do you remember those old web pages that are Angel Fire web pages?
Yeah.
From the 90s? Okay. So
and that's how I learned about the internet, basically.
So I found a guy, and I'm going to credit him. His thing is marksfriggin.com. I don't know if that's his name or that's his deal or what. I don't know a lot about him. He kept pretty detailed notes of that Howard Stern show news archives. And you can go through, it looks like you can go through and read a lot of them. It's there's a Stern show news main page, and then there's all these different pieces of his site that you can go through and read day by day what happened. Now, to answer the question you're asking, do I feel like this was recorded and then put on the air? I think it's partially live.
Okay, well, so what does his statement mean then? I can't even get a phone system that works on air.
Well, part of that is him, sort of jabbing at, the powers that be related to.
So it's not relevant then.
I don't know.
A couple of the other things that happened were, so he says, I don't have a phone system that'll work on air, much less, a phone system that'll trace a number or something to that effect. But then he says there's a point in the conversation where they're talking and Clay is talking, and then Howard says, go ahead, as if, it's sort of out of place, something was said there that's not there. And then he also says something with regard to his ex-fiance. He says, if I wouldn't be a suspect, and then it sort of switches off of that, and it seems like that is cut. So there's several places in the conversation that to me, they don't flow correctly, they've been edited.
Okay, I couldn't tell if it was an edit or not. I did catch the fiance thing. Basically, I think he made a threat, and then maybe they had to, like, some of that stuff can happen with a slight delay. Like, so I guess my point is there's not necessarily live and then only edited. Sometimes there's a delay.
Well, sure, and just because the call was sort of done ahead of time and edited, it doesn't mean that the conversation was planned or not happening live. It just means that it went through the editing room before it was put out on
Correct.
air. Now, he also says at a certain point, which also gives it quite a bit of authenticity, and I'm sure you notice, he's like, is this Howard?
Yeah, he doesn't seem to know that it's Howard. He thinks he's still talking to the prep people.
Right. And so, he was answering the questions, and if you sort of listen to that part, because he's like, dude, you're a serial killer and you're getting away with it because you're killing prostitutes. And I guess it was something in his voice, maybe a certain word, his accent caught, that the guy goes, is this Howard? And then the whole tone of the conversation changes.
Right.
And then he was like, and Howard's like, hello. And he's like, well, I didn't know this was Howard. It was almost like he didn't realize. So I wondered, like, if he had known he was talking to Howard to begin with, would he have continued? Would he have answered those questions the same way?
Well, you know what? I wondered about that as well. Have you ever called into a radio show?
No.
So I used to, it would have been right after this. I used to work as a security guard for like a big distribution center. And I would, my job for almost a year, I sat in this little shack where trucks would go by and I would write down all the information about the driver in the truck for them to enter this facility. If they were coming in with product, I had to write down seal information and all information about the containers and like where it came from. Anyways, it was a very boring job. I did it I worked there for multiple years, but I did this job. This was almost like an initiation, right? So I would call into radio shows. So the reason I'm saying that is, this one summer I won tickets to like so many things because something about where I was, it was almost like I had a direct line into this particular radio station. Like it was almost like I picked up the phone and dialed it, and I never got a busy signal.
That's so funny.
I went straight in every time I called them, and I'd be caller 3, caller 10, and like just dial them right back. Well, when I was doing all of that, I wasn't calling Howard Stern. I was still listening to Howard Stern, but like he was at an odd time. But there would always be a person who was a screener that picked up the phone. Depending on the show, it might be the host, it might not be. And at the time Howard Stern was doing this, he was already pretty big. He definitely would have had some level of screener, meaning that Clay told someone part of this story for Howard to have the description that he says before he takes the call.
Right. No question. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that has to have happened.
So why would he think he was giving it again?
Well, so Howard Stern was a big deal. Even in '97, he was a big deal. And the reason I tend to think there would have been a delay is because the whole point of a delay is to keep obscenity off the air. Howard Stern is already playing so deep in what would be known as like blue comedy or blue material, meaning blue means it's, adult material. He's so deep into that. I have no doubt that probably Baba Booey, who he is Gary. I think we had this conversation, right? We talked about Baba Booey being.
I know that that's him. We did, because I was like, so what does Baba Booey mean? And yeah, he said
yeah. So he's his executive. Gary is Howard's executive producer, and I think he was like, he may still be. I'd have to look it up to like get the particulars on that, but. The information that's passing back and forth, by the time Howard gets it, it's already been set up. So I went and found this archive, so to speak. And in this archive at Mark Friggins, he breaks down hour by hour what's happening on Howard Stern's show for every day. And each day will have 9 or 10 entries. So this date that this happened is going to be August the 13th, 1997. So that show opened, and Clay is fourth on the list of entries here. So the first thing that happened is Howard Stern at 7 o'clock that morning talks to Lee Covington, who is the author of How to Dump Your Wife. Howard has heard about this book that tells guys how to dump their wives the right way so they don't lose everything. He's reached out to the guy who wrote it. He thought it was a guy. Turns out that Lee Covington was a woman, and she wrote the book after her boyfriend had gone through a messy divorce. Howard talks to her for quite a while this morning. He thinks the book is one of the coolest things out there. He takes phone calls from listeners who wanted some advice for their own situations related to this. The book may be hard to find, so they gave them the 800 number. Basically, it says if you don't know how to dump your wife, give this book a try. That's the first section. The second section, Howard at 8 o'clock a.m., so it's an hour after the Lee Covington bit, he brings up the fact, and it says abruptly, whatever that means in radio, that Robin is denying her boyfriend access to her back door during sex. Jackie found this out yesterday and thought it would interest those of you who follow Robin's sex life. So there's a whole thing that goes on for a couple of minutes about Robin's sex life. At 8:05, Howard starts to do an impression called Sternak the Impossible, which is based off this old Johnny Carson bit. And then it goes on for 45 minutes. He goes through sort of the news and happenings around New York. And then at the end of that bit, so Al Rosenberg he was in, and he has done an Ed McMahon impression. So there's this Ed McMahon impression that has happened, and Howard is doing this thing like Johnny Carson, and then Al Rosenberg ends up doing an impression of Ed McMahon's laugh through this whole segment, and he stays in character for the entire show, and the stupid laugh goes the whole time. So that starts at 8:05, but at 8:30, this guy Clay, the prostitute killer, he calls in. He claims that he killed 12 prostitutes, that he's from New Orleans. The guy talks about how he tells these women that they're going to die and what he does to them. He said that he strangled one of his victims and the others were killed with a hammer blow to the head. His first kill was when he was 16 years old in a parking garage. One prostitute was a black transvestite. While he's on the phone, a psychologist calls in and asks him a couple of questions. He asks if Clay wet his bed or lit fires when he was young. Clay said he didn't. The psychologist said that a lot of serial killers were bedwetters and arsonists when they were children. There was nothing else that Howard could do, so he hangs up on Clay. And then there's this whole bit about celebrity pharmacy records where they're talking about, Howard and Robin. The following morning, they kick off at 6:05 a.m., and the first segment, which is Thursday, August the 14th, 1997, it says that the FBI contacts Howard about Clay, the serial killer. The entry that Mark Friggins has on here says, yesterday a guy called in and said that he had killed 12 prostitutes. Well, it wasn't a fake call because after the show, the FBI called and asked for the tape of the call. Clay, as he called himself, knew details about the killings that only the killer could know. Robin seems to think the guy wants to get caught because why else would he have called the show? If anything else happens, Howard says he'll let him know. Are you with me on all that?
Yeah.
So the Ed thing, the reason I say the Ed thing is because at the beginning of the call, there's this whole thing about, is this Ed? And that seems to be kind of a mistake that was made.
Right, because, hi, is this Ed? And then he says, no. And Robin says, oh, so you've never killed any prostitutes? And he said, no, I never said my name was Ed.
I think that the reason that Ed comes up is because Al Rosenberg is doing the bit about Ed McMahon that Ed gets mentioned. That's the reason the name Ed comes up. I've been trying to follow this. They replay this bit. This guy has it all archived. It's very interesting. So this bit was replayed on Friday, March 14, 2008 and Sunday, October 4, 2009. Basically, they replayed these calls. People say that like there's like all right, so people say that there were multiple calls from Clay, the prostitute killer, which is why I pulled up this whole archive. We've just proven that it's August the 13th for this. What you proved is that Russell Elwood is definitely in jail at that time, doing a stint for a probation violation for 80 days. He's been in since August the 4th. What people are calling multiple calls from killers is accurate. So on Thursday, August the 7th of 1997, a guy called in, and this guy's from Newark, Ohio. This is his story. In Mark Friggan's Mark's Friggan notes, it says 20-year-old caller may have killed someone. This is Thursday, August the 7th at 7:10 a.m. This guy called in to talk to Howard. He was a little high on alcohol and marijuana. He told Howard that he just got back out of jail on May 19th of this year. He was in there because he and a friend had beat the crap out of some guy. The reason they beat the crap out of the guy was pretty interesting. And again, I'm reading somebody's diary basically about Howard Stern. I don't know the guy's real name, so let's call him Killer. So Killer and his friend Jamie were at a party. Killer found a woman that liked him, and they went upstairs to a room to do their thing. A little while after Killer went upstairs, his buddy Jamie noticed that the woman had come downstairs and was talking to someone. Jamie overheard her saying that she left Killer upstairs in the dark and that there was some guy giving him oral sex. Of course, when Jamie heard this, she went up into the room. She turns on the light. Killer saw that he was getting the oral sex from a guy, and he freaked out. So Killer and Jamie took the guy outside and proceeded to beat the crap out of the guy. They beat him really bad, had to call an ambulance, but he didn't die. So Killer and Jamie went to court, and they were sent to prison for 1.5 years. Jamie got out a few weeks before Killer, and Killer said he got out May 19th, and 3 days later, they found the guy who gave them oral sex and shot him in the head. They found the guy who had given him oral sex and shot him in the head. He alluded to the fact that he had done it, but wouldn't actually say, "I did it." He kept hinting at it a bunch of times, and he knew details about a shooting that sure made it sound like he did it. He said that the guy was beat up before he was shot, and that he was shot execution style in the back of the head. And then he gave some details about himself that may lead to him getting arrested. He said that he's from Newark, Ohio. He also had a buddy by the name of Jamie. I'm not sure if he gave his own first name or not. If you live in the area, know anything about this incident, you should report it to the police. One other person made a confession in Howard's show a few years ago, and it changed the whole case around when it went to court. Okay, so this entry in Mark's thing here, this diary that he's doing, it made me realize a couple of things. So one, that's the week before Clay calls in. In my opinion, that could be why Clay calls in. Or it could also be a reason for Clay to make up his story. Later on, this guy that Mark references as Killer, he calls back in. All right. On August the 15th of 1997, 8 o'clock a.m., the guy who called in on August the 7th and basically confessed to killing someone called back, said he was a member of the Aryan Nation when he was in jail. After he made the confession on the air, he was contacted by the Aryan Nation. They told him to tell Howard that any violence committed had nothing to do with the Aryan Nation. The guy sounded extremely nervous. He also said that the Newark, Ohio police had gotten some phone calls and were investigating whether or not there was a murder committed in the area. The alleged killer said the murder didn't happen in Newark, but he wouldn't tell Howard where it did happen. He was sober this morning, so he didn't confess anything else. That's after Clay.
Okay, I believe that, so I think that answers that, because I think that people who maybe have, like somebody like me, I never listened to Howard Stern, and they just sort of lumped it all together.
Yeah, I think it's been lumped all together, and clearly there's some confession that apparently happened earlier on that I'm going to go.
Has that guy been caught? Do you have any idea?
I don't know. I just started running this stuff down.
And is Jamie in the first killer story? Is that a male or female?
I think that it's a male.
Okay, because I think you said her, and then you said that they went and beat the guy up, and
There was a girl there.
Right. But, and so, Jamie can be a boy's or a girl's name, and your wife's name is Jamie, so you would, associate it with a female. I was just curious because I'm not sure what you actually said now, but it just seemed weird if a girl was beating up a guy. I don't know.
No. So the idea is that like some kind of trick happened, like he thought he was going into the room with her, and
I understood that part.
Oh, okay. I mean,
I got that. That is not a good idea to do that to somebody.
No, not at all. It's a weird situation to put somebody in. What we have here is we have some bits. I'm going to go look for the older one. I'm going to look for audio on these. If I can find them, I'll share them. If not, okay.
That's not. I mean, it's not as.
Yeah, that's more complicated to do. But I would like to see how it's handled because I'm leaning towards this is real.
Okay, so yes, I feel like it is real with Clay. You're talking about with Clay.
Yeah.
Okay, and so we can look into the other situation and sort of see if there's resolution there, because there's a lot of details there that it seems like it should have been resolved.
And that is what we pulled out for this that we're talking here. You ran down a list of clues and details that we are taking a harder look at.
Right, because so with regard to the authenticity of the caller and the call being not a planned staged bit, it seems to me like the is this Howard comment, that would be a really strange thing to have in a bit.
Yeah, it would be weird too. Yeah, a lot of times when people record, that would be a weird thing to include. It seemed genuine. It seemed authentic. It could have just been they let the tape roll and they left that in.
Well, sure, but it is entirely possible the guy was lying. But so what I started getting at was, I think that he had a moment of hesitation when he realized he was actually talking with Howard. He certainly changed, sort of his approach there. I agree with that. Because, so one of the things I noticed was when Howard would ask him a question, he would respond and say, do you think you're doing this because you were abused? And he's like, well, no, Howard, I was not abused. He inserts the name, which, obviously he's having a conversation with Howard and Robin, and it's Clay, Howard, and Robin. So it's not necessary for him to, it'd be like me saying, your name over and over again as I'm responding to you. Clearly I'm talking to you. I don't need to say your name over and over again. I feel like he was sort of dealing with the fact that, it was exciting to him to actually have made it on. I don't know if he'd ever tried to make it on the show before.
That's interesting, yeah.
There's no way to know that because, I assume there's producers who, they don't let everybody on the show. And I don't know how much you were talking about, the pre-screening process. I don't know how much he had to go through, to get on the air, because you could call. I mean, I don't know how that works anymore, but I remember how it was back then because I listened to the radio back then. We didn't have iTunes and all these other options out there. It was the radio waves that are a cassette. That's what we had to listen to. And so I remember he would have gone through a pre-screening process, and you could say something pretty dramatic during that process to get on the air to perhaps say something else, which, like you said, that's why there's delays, because at one point in time, there was huge fines from the FCC or whoever is over broadcasting for bad language or inappropriate content.
Right.
But it's weird to me, that, for example, when you're reading off, Robin was denying her boyfriend access to her back door, that doesn't get edited out, but this random threat he made against an unnamed person gets edited out. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And so I can't wrap my brain around what the level of, where's the threshold there? Because he is talking about murdering women. And so it does, however, it does seem weird, though, because either he didn't finish his thought, or they cut it out. And if they did cut it out, it doesn't really make sense why they cut it out. But maybe they did. I have no idea. But then the other part that's really strange, and so I've listened to this, several times over the past, I don't know, couple weeks or however long it's been. And when he says, go ahead, it's like they cut something else out there, because it should be like him partially interrupting Howard and stopping, and then him saying, go ahead. You and I have had this happen on the show all the time, where we're trying to talk over one another and one of us says, go ahead.
Yeah, we have to be really careful because of the way the files come to us for the podcast. We have to be careful who's speaking when. And a lot of times, we'll even take extra pauses that may not be heard by the audience, but we'll take them so that the other person has a clear stop and start.
Right, because we don't want to.
Yeah, we don't want to stop like this. Exactly.
But that's what seems like should have happened there, where Howard says, go ahead, because there's no lead in specifically where it would have been he's talking. So why would he need to say go ahead? It's just a really strange thing. And that's why I was like, well, is it edited? So for the purposes of our discussion here, we are going to say that, even if it was edited, it was barely edited. And that for the most part, this content, for whatever reason, these little anomalies occurred, they're just part of the conversation. The conversation is a weird conversation.
Yeah, so it's not structured like a bit, I'll say that. And if it was written, or at least loosely outlined, it's brilliant.
And I can't tell for certain. I do think that a personality like Howard, and then of course, Robin, them talking to somebody who is loosely, playing a part, I feel like it could produce something like this, right? Absolutely.
Oh, absolutely could. And but, I wondered about him talking to Robin, though, if the hatred of women thing, and I wondered about, is that why he keeps saying Howard, because he's directing certain things to Howard? No, because
he said Robin too. He's like, well, I don't know Robin, and so
it's pretty dismissive though.
Well, but he doesn't have a problem with women. He has a problem with prostitutes. That's different.
Well, I want to run down your list. I want you to keep talking here, but I want to run down your list here in a second, because I think some of these things could never have been in a bit.
It would have had to have been a very either well thought out bit or a based on a true story bit. There is a lot. From the jump, you've got this guy who initially he doesn't realize he's on the air, much less talking. Because normally they'll say you're on the air with Howard Stern or something like that, right? Give the caller the the info that they're on radio air. But he doesn't say that. He said, we've got a guy on the line who says he's a prostitute killer, and he's like, is this Ed? And he's like, no. And Robin says, so you haven't killed any prostitutes? And she's laughing, and he says, no, I never said my name was Ed.
Yeah, and that's why I mentioned in the archives that Ed bit had been going on for a while, for multiple.
See, but that makes it why would he think that guy was Ed?
He wasn't listening to that part of the show.
I see.
But what I'm saying is, I think that Howard and Robin were sort of just rolling with it.
Well, sure, especially if there was somebody that called the week before that had. I mean, I can only imagine the possibilities of people that would call into the show. And like I said, I don't listen to the show. I didn't listen to it in 1997. So I don't have a good grasp on, what's happening there as far as what is the shock value of that. Now, I did find, because you sent it to me. So I was thinking that, okay, we need to find a guy who worked at a restaurant in 95-ish and said Baba Booey, because I didn't know what it was, but had nothing to do with the guy Clay. It had to do with the show because
right. It's an ongoing thing.
Right. And so it was like a call sign, sort of like, so people in other mediums would be like Baba Booey. And so it would be like a indirect shout out to Howard Stern.
Right.
Okay. And it signified like a joke.
Yeah. It's oddly, it is. It's not just that. He's like trying to fit in with them.
Well, right. And so, but when he says it here, because I didn't understand what it meant at first. Like I had, when I went back and listened to it after I knew what it meant. And there's examples of, people using it and like what it meant and all that kind of stuff. But I realized that like he was saying like, I could say this is just a joke, but I'm not.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. Let me run down this call for a second, and I assume people have heard this. This is from the episode. Is this real? This is a phone call of Clay the prostitute killer calling into Howard Stern, and Meg went through and pulled up a list of sort of like things we would be hunting down. So you say the first half, but I didn't see where you said the second half, so I'm just going to read this. If the first half part is important, you're going to have to tell me. So he starts with, "You can call me Clay." He says that he's killed 12 prostitutes, although later Howard says killed 15 people. He says that he does it for the sense of the power, and that he strangled one of them. A few times, actually most times, he kills them with a hammer. When asked how does he kill them, he says he's done it twice in a parking garage, and the rest of the times are on the side of the road. He says that he was in the New Orleans area and that he killed a nutria rat that was in the kitchen at his work during a flood. He clubbed it to death. He was 16 at the time of his first murder, and I'm pretty sure he says that one of the parking garage murders is that one. He was going to send clues, or he sent clues, depending on how you hear him. But he felt like it would baffle them. It turned out that nobody noticed him for a long time.
They didn't notice the victim, I believe. Like they didn't. Like he was thinking there was going to be like a missing person, and like.
Okay.
And he didn't, that's the impression I got. And because that didn't happen, he was like, well, why would I do that since nobody's even noticed this person's gone?
Right. And so they ask him if this is the first victim. And instead he says probably one of the, I think she's probably one of the ones that they found.
Right.
So they ask him if he was going to be sending clues or doing that. He says that he wanted to be famous and he wanted to draw attention to himself. His problem was that that is what he wanted to do, but that no one noticed the clues he'd left behind. So he never sent any more clues, and he ended up not leaving anything. He gets a little jumbled here, but he basically said that he had wanted to have his own little signature. He said something about he wanted to finger paint, and they start asking him questions about this.
With their thumbs.
Yeah, so he wanted to use their thumbs to paint. Says that this was in a comic book a couple of years ago, and that it seemed like a good idea that you take a girl, and I thought they were going to say blood here, but he doesn't. They don't mention it. Howard or Robin being they, but he takes the girl that you've killed, you dip her thumbs into paint, and then you make like a little thumb painting. They ask him if he's going to do that on a piece of paper. He says yes. He says the closest that he's come to playing with that body. And then he's sort of he keeps stopping and starting his sentences.
Well, and Howard was asking him if he played with the bodies after he killed them, which is, a necrophilia type question that I think it embarrassed the guy.
He says the closest thing that he had ever done was to always make sure that he paid them and then make sure that they keep their money. And with one of them, he put the money in a compromising place. And this is where he mentions that he thinks he did it to this one. He said, it had a penis. So Howard says it was a guy, and he says, I didn't know. They ask him if he's had kids. So he says he's had a couple of kids, but he's not married to mom. And Howard very smartly asked him if he's a white guy. And he says yes. And he then points out that it's pretty funny because the only suspect they had when all this started, when they started finding the bodies, was a black police officer. It turns out that one of them was associated with them. I don't know what he means by that, but I almost felt like he was claiming the bodies that were attached to Gant.
Right, and we
There
sort
were
of have
two
to
of them.
we have to sort of keep in mind that in that scenario, when we're talking about Victor Gant, who was suspected because his girlfriend and a friend of hers ended up being victims of, this what they think is a serial killer, and then Russell Elwood is he's the one of the top two suspects, the other one being Victor Gant. There's like 24 victims there, I believe.
26 total.
26,
There's 26
okay.
victims.
Okay, so there's 26 victims total, and that would all be before this phone call. And because he's being like sort of brutally honest, if he's only killed 12 people, then they're not all his victims.
I know that's what makes this guy so fascinating to me, is that he could be real and the other two scenarios could also be real, and like it could all just be sitting there unsolved. That's the reason that I'm digging into this so much. Otherwise, this is probably annoying to some people, but like I'm going through this list of clues because I feel like there's something to it all.
I don't see why this would be annoying. It's like one of the most fascinating things ever to me. Like the fact that this guy called in and I actually am very surprised at the people attributing it to Russell Elwood, because very quickly you and I realized, if he did make that call, it should be traceable because he was incarcerated.
Right. And so they continue down this path with Clay. So Howard asks him if he does any drugs. He says he doesn't do any serious drugs. The idea is he's gotten stoned and tripped some, but he doesn't. He's basically saying he doesn't do the hard drugs. He doesn't do, from the line that he's drawing, it appears that he's not going to be doing coke, MDMA, or heroin type drugs. He says sometimes he kills people just because he's bored, and that one night he killed 2 people in the same night, but he went to Mississippi for the second one. He said there's no pattern to his time frame when he's asked, like, is there like a pattern to what he's doing? He said there can be many weeks or many days between the murders. And they ask him about like who he's killing. And he says a fair number of them have been black chicks. Those are his words. And he says,
well, because Howard asked, are these white chicks? Are they black chicks? And so he's like, well, a fair number of them have been black.
Yeah, and so the transvestite was black. His words, not mine. He doesn't have a real racial motivation, just wherever it is. And they ask him where that is. And he says the word Jimmy Swaggart Town. And at the time, not everybody may remember even who Jimmy Swaggart is. Do you remember who he was off the cuff?
I didn't remember who he was off the cuff, but I did, of course, look him up.
Yeah, so Jimmy Swaggart was an American Pentecostal evangelist of some notoriety. He is still alive. I want to say he'd be close to 90. In 1988, Swaggart was implicated in a sex scandal involving a prostitute, which resulted in his suspension and then ultimately his defrocking by the Assemblies of God. Several years after this, he was implicated in another scandal also involving a prostitute. And as a result, Swaggart's ministry became non-affiliated, non-denominational, and significantly smaller than it was in the ministry's pre-scandal years. So 1988, 1991, he was the very first one. He was based out of Louisiana when the first one happened. He was actually, on February 21st of 1988, he had this whole thing where he said that he had sinned. And at the time, this would have been when Jimmy Swaggart Ministries, just so we're clear, it was actually based out of Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Well, and I wondered about that because I feel like him referring to, Jimmy Swaggart Town, I wondered, that's obviously a hint of some sort.
Right.
But, it boils down to, it's basically what if you travel to countries that have the red light district. Have you ever heard of that?
Yeah.
Okay. And so that's my interpretation of what he's saying, but there could be many of them. But
one of these is in California. This is the 1991 incident, but I was really interested in the 1988 one. Go ahead.
Right. Because it's Louisiana. And I went back to look so why would people call it Jimmy Swaggart Town? Well, because it's where Jimmy Swaggart picked up his prostitute.
And ultimately, that's where we sort of land with this. The allegations of Jimmy Swaggart having done things, a number of years, he had been known for being involved potentially with New Orleans prostitutes. And essentially in 1988, it was alleged that he had picked up a prostitute named Peggy in New Orleans. And she believed that he was Swaggart, had picked him up at a place called Airline Highway, which was a pickup strip on the outskirts of town. So they bring her on the news and sort of trot her out there. And one of the big things about it was that he had lied to her, said he was in the neighborhood arranging some kind of adoption, whatever. And then he asked her to perform a sex act for $10, which she felt like was insulting because she could tell that it was Jimmy Swaggart. She said no, and ends up he kicked her out of the car. When this was heard about, a private investigator gets involved, and that private investigator attracts Swaggart to Sleazy Motel, and the idea is everything that Swaggart says after that is tainted. So this is sort of his downfall, but why the Jimmy Swaggart Town reference is specifically to these seedy outskirt motels around New Orleans.
Right. Okay. So this is where this guy would go. And specifically, he made a point of saying that it wasn't racially motivated because he didn't approach any of these girls. So he goes to Jimmy Swaggart Town and then he waits for them to approach him.
This is where the prostitutes hang out. They come up to him. That's what he tells Robin. And then he has let one go.
He's let a couple go, actually. And, that's another part I felt like was sort of, it sounded like it might be edited because he very confidently is because Howard's saying have you ever looked into their eyes and thought these people, they used to just be children and, felt sorry for them. And he's like, I've let a couple go. And it sounds like it's, it's
a little guilty.
Well, yeah, but it also sounds like there's a cut there.
Maybe there's some information we don't have from the call.
It's possible, but I'm not saying that for certain. I'm just saying the flow is going to be chaotic anyway, so I may just be picking up on the chaos. But
It would be weird to suddenly be interviewing a serial killer and it maybe being real.
I think it was weird for him to suddenly be talking to Howard Stern, especially since he had this whole conversation before he even realized he was talking to Howard Stern. And I feel like I think it swayed what we learned.
Oh, absolutely, I do too. As he starts to get into this part of the call, Howard asked him if he has been married, and he says that he was engaged at one point, never married. He's no longer engaged, and that there's back and forth between Howard and Robin over this. And he says, if I hadn't been a suspect, I believe maybe she'd, and that's where it cuts off weirdly, one of the big times, because you were thinking maybe he said she'd be dead too, or she'd be out there with him, or something like that, right?
That's what I think, because it seemed to me like that's what he was getting at. And then the conversation continues just like he had finished the sentence, but he didn't. And it seemed like a really weird thing to hop over.
Yeah, it is. So Howard asked him if he's a good-looking guy. He says that he's an average-looking guy and he supports himself. They ask him about his last kill. And at first he says it's been a few months. And then I guess he starts kind of doing calendar math in his head. And he says, actually, it's going on a year.
Right. And that actually comes up again because they start talking about self-control, and he says, well, I believe I am controlling myself. And he's like, what, a few months you haven't killed? And then Robin and Clay both say, no, it's almost a year. Like, so it comes up.
And then Howard asks him if he's going to kill himself. He says, no, if he killed himself, he'd miss the next Batman movie. So he stopped killing all of a sudden, and then it had to do with his car breaking down. Howard asked him how things went from the other side. I think Robin asked a question in there. And
do they see it coming, right?
Do they see it coming? He says, no one really fights back. No one's been close to catching him. He said there was a victim in the newspaper once, and someone close to him or who worked with him or around him joked that they knew it was him. But then they sort of backed off of it like, they were joking. He does not have any tattoos. He says, I wouldn't do that to myself. He has gotten drunk before. And Howard starts to ask him questions here about like who he's told. He says that Howard is now the only one who's ever told about it. And that he had told a couple of the women, but they're dead, so they don't count, is the idea. Howard asks him how he breaks the news to his victim. And he says that you can play the running game if you're out in the middle of nowhere. And we got a lot of middle of nowhere down here. So in other words, Howard says, in other words, you're with a woman and you say to her, okay, honey, you just had sex and everything. How do you break the news to her that she's going to die? He said, it really depends on the mood that he's in. But just to give you an example, if I wanted, I could say Baba Booey, but they would be pretty, and Howard says, no, come on, serious. What would you say to that? And the call starts to veer off here. He doesn't really answer a whole lot of useful things in the second half. Did you have a second half of Clues that you sent me?
No, I didn't. I didn't finish it. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. That's actually more than enough because I had been working with like Clay and the Hammer thing. Did you have anything else you want to say about Clay on this episode before we come back to him?
Well, no, not really. I feel like, a couple of things actually. I'm sorry.
It's fine.
So I feel like we were trying to pen an age on this caller, and there are at least 2 times, possibly more times, that he makes references. Like for example, he saw the thumb painting. Then he saw the hammer situation, killing them with a hammer. And then he talks about Batman. But so the thumb painting and killing them with a hammer, he got both of those from books or comic books. Okay.
Right.
And so I was trying to sort of pen an age, with those types. So he's got a couple of kids. All right. So there's that. You could actually be fairly young and have a couple of kids.
Right.
And especially since it doesn't really seem like he is very involved with his children, because he would certainly have better things to do than go hang out in Jimmy Swaggart Town if he was a hands-on father.
I think you have to be sort of a certain age to be going to, I mean, I know young people pick up prostitutes, but I think that's also indicative of something more than 18 to 21 years old, don't you?
Well, I definitely don't think he's 18. I was thinking more around 25. And so I need to do some math here, which is always fun on the show. So, okay, here's what I was thinking. I think that, so the call is in 1997. And I think his first victim was in 1991. So that would make him 16 in 1991. And if we add 6 years...
It's 23?
24. Or 23 or 24 or 25, I guess, depending on what his birthday is. Okay, so that's what I was thinking. Because his first victim is going to be a victim that was killed in a parking garage and dumped on the side of the road and not noticed for a while.
Okay.
So he says all that, in the course of the conversation, he says, and he believes that she's one of the ones that was found. And so he's 16 years old. He has his first kill. And so if we're looking at, if he's older than that, we're looking at a bigger span of time. However, the way that he's talking about it, when they started finding the bodies, the only suspect they had was a black cop who was associated with one of them. All right, so that's implying bodies are being found. He doesn't necessarily say that they're all his bodies, right? His victims' bodies. But he's saying, like, when the bodies start being found, that's the only person they could come up with. So this is before Russell Elwood comes into the picture, right? The only suspect is Victor Gant. It is mentioned. So by a certain point in time, that's actually quite a bit before the phone call, there is this sort of body of knowledge of these. I keep wanting to say 24, but you're saying it's 26. So
There's
maybe
26
it's before the last two.
So here's the deal. There are 26 of them total, but they consider 2 of them off the books because of Russell Elwood. There's also actually 4 additional victims. There's a total of 30 victims, but 4 of them are alive.
Okay, so I have the number. It doesn't really matter, but what I saw was a reference because he says that there was something in the newspaper that, you know, somebody that he was acquainted with said, I know you did it, but they were just joking. And so I start looking for, okay, what were they reading, right? Because it had to have been before August of 1997 because he's got the knowledge of it to talk about it in the phone call already, right? And so one of the pieces that I saw was there was knowledge that there were these 24 linked victims that a serial killer was killing in Louisiana. And they say that they were being dumped in the swamp areas. That's what is said.
Some of them are. This case ends up being what's known as the Storyville Slayer. That's what you keep seeing 24. This section of murders in the early 90s is known as the Storyville Slayer. They have multiple different. They have multiple killers. Is the bottom line. The police theorize that it's a single killer, but which is probably why they never caught him. Right. That's why this person has not been caught, because like every time they had a suspect, they could be ruled out of certain things. Storyville is the red light district of New Orleans. From 1897 to 1917, Storyville was literally something you've mentioned before, which is the red light districts. But in this instance, I think I figured out who she is. Like, if you're going with that timeline, is it the 17-year-old? No, she's 21. Okay, her name is Tierra Toussaint. Okay, and she's one of the ones listed, attributed in the group to Victor Gant. And so, I have felt like, so I haven't really gotten that far yet. I don't know if he killed Danielle. Is that who you're talking about? Is she 17? Danielle is 17, but she was beaten pretty badly and strangled. Okay, and when was her murder? August 4th of 1991. Okay, Tierra Toussaint is September 3rd, 1991. Okay, I have felt like that Danielle, and I hate that I don't know her name, but I was focusing on the age. So I felt like 17-year-old Danielle was his first victim. That could be the case. And that does not rule out your victim at all, because I feel like you're going to see, especially since he's calling Howard in August. Okay, you've got Danielle being killed in August, and then his last murder, I'm guessing, was like, September-ish or the end of August of 96. And so you're going to see this pattern. And, August, for some reason, is a big deal to this guy. I have no idea why. But there were some other things that I saw. But I think I sent, from the list that's been gathered, I was like, do you see the pattern here? And, so we started sort of analyzing that. I haven't analyzed it to the extent I probably will before we're done. But to me, it just seemed like it was pretty clear who his victims might be from that list versus who his victims were not. Yeah. The other thing was, one of the things that is considered to be across all the cases was that they were being drugged. And Clay doesn't mention anything about drugging his victims. No, I actually, a number of the ones that I've pulled out for Clay's victims, they did not die from strangulation or smothering. And they did not have anything close to like an overdose going on.
Right. And so I thought, just based on some of the other things that have come up, specifically with this type of victim that can be associated with what is considered to be a high-risk lifestyle, law enforcement often refer to them as prostitute murders, is sometimes they're just doing drugs. And then when drugs are in their system, when they die, it can be kind of semantically changed to have been that, they were drugged and killed when they were really just partaking recreationally in the drugs.
What I'm trying to do next is I'm going to put together like what I think might be the pattern for you to look at. And it's not something I can do like while we're recording because it's a little confusing, but I think Danielle Britton is a possibility for the first victim.
Well, because if he was 16, it would make sense that his first kill would be a 17-year-old, because I don't know that he would have gone for like a way more mature woman to begin with.
Well, I ruled out 3 victims because of their age that year. But what was interesting about 1991 and why I think 1991 is probably right is because of the Storyville slayings, they had 2 victims that year that were let go. And they were very young. One was 20 and the other was 19.
And when did that happen?
1991. So in July of 1991, there was a girl who was strangled and left for dead but lived. In August of 1991, Danielle Britton is killed. And in September, Tiara Tassin is 21 and she was killed. The next 2 deaths that happened that are considered Storyville Strangler deaths are not his. One is Charlene Prince. She's 28 years old. One is Regina Akash. She's 37 years old. He didn't do those. But the week before Christmas, there was a Jane Doe who was 20 years old who was strangled, and they believe that she was raped. She gets lumped into everything. She lives. And I think she was the victim that was let go. So the first girl, I think she just survived because this guy didn't do it right. So then he tried again with Danielle, and then he beat Tiara Tassin in the head with a hammer. So,
and that could be totally possible. I have a feeling there that I don't feel like he would have started and not finished. At least not purposefully. So I don't know that the ones that survived are going to be the let go ones. I think the ones that were let go never even knew they were in the car with the Storyville Slayer or whatever.
Interesting.
I think
that could be true.
Well, that's what he says in the phone call. Like, that's what he says when he's talking to Howard.
He lets them go.
Basically, he says, like, I didn't even have sex with them. I just let them go. Like, he's like, I didn't understand what they were doing, what they were trying to do, being prostitutes. It didn't make any sense to me. I felt sorry for them. And so I think they had no idea how close they were to dying. I think even today, they wouldn't realize that they had been in the vehicle with that guy.
Well, my guess is that we could probably figure out, and I've got 5 cases for the male victim that he references in the call. I'm trying to say that.
And the thing about that is, I don't think it's going to be all 5.
What do you mean it's still not going to be all 5?
He only says the one.
No, I have 5 possibilities.
But I'm saying, so who killed the other 4?
That's what's interesting about all of this.
He was so, if it had been, more than that, he would have said it kept happening, because we're looking at the point in time that by the time the phone calls made in 1997, all of the 5 transgender women, or however many transgender women are in this group, they had all been killed by that point. And so because he says, and these are his words, it had a penis, he made a big deal in his mind about this one victim that was a transgender woman and had a penis. I feel like it would have been an equal portioned big deal for it just kept happening. I had 4 of those or 5 of those or whatever, right? But he doesn't say anything like that.
Well, I think it happened in 1992, and I honestly think that I think that this guy is responsible for some killings in 1992 that are not on the Storyville Strangler list.
Well, and we also need to keep in mind that he says the first one was in a parking garage and then dumped on the side of the road, and another one was in a parking garage, and the rest were just dumped on the side of the road. But he also says, I believe she was one of the ones that they found, which implies that by 1997, to Clay's knowledge, some of them had still not been found.
Yeah, and that becomes complicated. So you asked me about patterns, and this is where I'm going to end this particular episode. From what I can tell here, I find the patterns of the Storyville Strangler match possibly 5 separate killers. I don't think it's one killer with 26 victims. I think that, and I don't think that like the killer is just killing these folks. There is a way to get at this and sort of, pull it apart. Ultimately, I think that we will find some of these killings could probably be attributed to any number of the suspects. But I do believe that Clay probably killed, from what I can guess, of the 24, 26, whatever how you want to say it. If you just say it's 24, it doesn't make that much difference. I think that Clay killed 7 of them right now.
Interesting. And do you think that as of August 1997, he has no reason to lie when he says he kills 12 prostitutes?
I think he killed 13.
Why would he lie?
He didn't. He miscounted.
Why? How's that?
Well, either he considers the Louisiana Mississippi night to be one murder.
Well, no, because he distinguishes that.
He said 2. Mm-hmm. So I have to think. I don't think he considered he called the person an it.
Right, but he considered that one of his kills. So, but why do you think it's 13?
I have one I can't put on anybody else. It seems like it would be him, but I'll come back on. It's a couple in 1994.
The John and Jane Doe?
Yep.
Well, couldn't that be the Mississippi situation?
I wondered about that.
They're not identified, so...
Right. We don't know exactly.
But I would say there's no reason that he would have lied or, miscounted. If you can tell me like what that means, but I feel like the Clay has never been caught, even to the extent that somebody made the phone call, whether it's true, false, a joke, right, whatever. So there was absolutely no reason for him to lie. And
well, I think one of the most important things that has come out of all of this is it's not Russell Elwood.
No question. It is not Russell Elwood. I said that I could tell by his face that it wasn't him. And, that's just my opinion. But the fact that he was in jail is substantiated, and he was in jail for 80 some days, and it began at the beginning of August. There was absolutely no way that he could have made a phone call that if the FBI investigated it, they should have been able to see that it was Russell Elwood that called the show because he was in custody.
Right.
And so because of that, I feel extraordinarily confident it wasn't him. And nobody's ever said anything one way or the other. Like, life now is so different than it was back in 1997. Like, to get on a radio show like that and have an audience like that, it was a big deal back then, right?
It was a huge deal.
And now it's not like that anymore.
Thank you for joining us. We are sponsored by LabRottiCreations.com. You can check them out at LabRottiCreations.com, and you can still use the code CRIMEXS for a fun pop pet portrait of your own pet. You can also reach us on Twitter, Instagram at TrueCrimeXS, or you can give us a call if you know anything about any of the cases that we're talking about at 252-365-5593. You can also reach us at Gmail at truecrimexs@gmail.com, and you can check out our website at www.truecrimexs.com. We'll see you next time.
Lost in a dreaming, reverie keeping a world of your own. The sun in the morning, rising, you're shining, all in a moment we hold. Everything we've come to know. Giving me eyes to see all of these beautiful things through the blue and gray. We're in a golden Out on a limb, we're catching the wind here. Start to begin and renewing hope. A star in the evening, golden and gleaming, all in a moment we hold. Everything we've come to know. You're giving